The Galactic Council chambers floated in the darkness of space, like a jewel catching starlight, and the structure orbited a neutron star that pulsed with ancient rhythm as if counting the seconds of eternity itself, and inside the massive station, representatives from 847 different species gathered in the Great Hall where decisions that shaped the fate of billions were made with the casual ease of beings who had never known. True Consequence Counselor Vextar stood at the central podium, and his crystalline form refracted the light into rainbow patterns across the walls, and he was proud, and he was certain, and he had never been wrong in 300 years of service to the Krillian diplomatic corps, and today would be no different, because today he presented what he called a minor administrative solution to a resource dispute that had dragged on for far too long. Esteemed colleagues, Vextar began, and his voice resonated through translation devices in every language known to the galaxy. The matter before us is simple, and the human colony on Terra Nova's third moon sits atop deposits of Crystal 7 that are worth more than their entire species' current economic output, and they are a Category 7. Developing species and barely spacefaring and militarily insignificant, and I propose we relocate them to a suitable alternative location and harvest the resources for the benefit of the greater galactic community. Around the chamber, there were murmurs of agreement, and a few species asked procedural questions about compensation and timeline, but no one objected and no one spoke for the humans, because humanity had only joined the galactic community 17 years ago, and they had no allies and no influence and no power to speak of. And the vote came swiftly, and the motion passed with 832 votes in favor and 11 abstentions, and 4 votes against. Nobody noticed the small flicker on the ancient mainframe deep in the restricted archives, and nobody heard the alert that chimed in a frequency no modern species could perceive, and nobody read the single line of text that appeared in a language dead for 40,000 years, and it said, "The children of Terra are inviolate," but the message went unheard on Terra Nova's third moon. The human settlement called New Hope stretched across a valley between 2 mountain ranges, and it was small and humble and home to 3,000 people, and most of them were families of miners and researchers who had come here seeking a fresh start and a chance to build something new, and the settlement had schools and gardens and a community center where people gathered on Friday nights to share meals and stories and laughter. Sarah Okonkwo was 9 years old, and she loved living on New Hope because she could see 3 different moons in the sky at night, and sometimes she would lie in the grass outside the habitat dome and count the stars and dream about visiting all of them someday. And her mother worked in the Geological Survey office, and her father maintained the water reclamation systems, and they were happy here. And this was home when the Council's enforcement fleet arrived in orbit. It was like a shadow falling across the sun, and the ships were massive and sleek, and they broadcast the evacuation order on all frequencies, and Governor Marcus Webb received the message in his office, and his hand shook as he read the words: "In 48 hours, and all personnel must evacuate, and no exceptions and no appeals." And the order came from the Galactic Council itself. And what could one small human colony do against the combined might of 800 worlds? The colonists protested, but they complied because they had no choice. And they had no weapons that could scratch the hull of even the smallest council ship, and they began loading their meager possessions onto the transport vessels and the old cargo haulers and the personal shuttles and anything that could make the journey back to the nearest human world, which was 6 weeks away at their ship's best speed. And people wept as they packed, and children asked questions their parents couldn't answer, and the community center emptied, and the gardens were abandoned, and New Hope began to die. Marcus Webb tried to coordinate the evacuation, but it was chaos, and there weren't enough ships, and there wasn't enough time, and the Council's fleet commander refused all requests for extension and refused to provide additional transport, and simply waited in orbit like a cold and patient executioner and the hours counted down, and families were separated, and belongings were left behind, and people made impossible choices about what to take and what to leave forever in the confusion. A transport ship called the Prairie Wind suffered a critical malfunction during the final boarding, and its main power coupling overloaded, and the backup systems failed, and the ship had to make an emergency launch with whoever was already aboard, because staying meant death for everyone on the vessel, and the captain made the call in the ship. Launched, and 17 children who were supposed to be on that ship were still on the surface, and they had been in emergency shelter running a safety drill when the Prairie Wind left without them. The children's names were Sarah Okonkwo and her best friend Marcus Chun, who was named after the governor, and Maya Rodriguez, who was 14 and the oldest, and Tommy Anderson, who was only 4, and twins named Keiko and Yuki Tanaka, and 11 others whose parents had been told they were safe on the ship, and the parents were already gone and already in space and already beyond reach when they discovered the terrible truth. Maya Rodriguez took charge immediately because someone had to, and she gathered the younger children in the emergency shelter, and she counted heads, and she checked supplies, and she found enough food and water for maybe a week if they were careful, and she told them all to stay calm, and she told them someone would come back for them, and she believed it because she was human, and humans didn't leave their children behind, and surely someone would realize, and surely someone would return. The last transport ship left New Hope 6 hours later, and the Council's enforcement fleet confirmed all humans had departed, and they began establishing mining operations on the surface, and they brought in automated equipment and processing plants, and they started tearing into the mountains to reach the Crystal 7 deposits, and the money flowed, and the resources shipped out, and 17 human children huddled in a shelter underground and waited for rescue that the galaxy believed was unnecessary. Admiral Sarah Chun received the message on Earth 3 days later, and she was in a meeting with the Joint Chiefs when her aide interrupted with the emergency communication, and the words hit her like a physical blow, and children, and missing, and left behind, and the Council won't respond to our inquiries. And Sarah Chun had served in the Earth Defense Force for 32 years, and she had seen combat in the border wars, and she had negotiated treaties, and she had buried friends, but nothing had ever made her feel the cold rage that filled her now. She immediately contacted the Galactic Council, and she sent messages through every diplomatic channel humanity possessed, and she demanded emergency intervention, and she demanded answers, and she demanded her children back, and the Council's automated response system acknowledged receipt of her communications and filed them under low priority, and no one responded, and no one cared because humanity was small and weak, and their complaints meant nothing. Sarah Chun made a decision, and she would take the UES Defiant, and it was humanity's newest destroyer, and barely tested, and probably no match for any serious Council warship, but it was what she had, and she would go to Terra Nova, and she would bring those children home, and if the Council tried to stop her, then they would learn that a mother bear protecting her cubs was the most dangerous creature in any forest on any world, and humanity had not forgotten how to fight. The U's Defiant prepared for launch at the Luna. Orbital yards and crews worked around the clock, loading supplies and running system checks, and Sarah Chun stood on the bridge watching Earth turn slowly below, and she thought about those 17 children alone in the dark, and she swore an oath to herself that she would not return without them, and that oath was written in her bones and in her blood and in the ancient human instinct that said children must be protected at any cost. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, strange things began to happen, and on the world of Velkara, the oldest library in known space started to glow with a light that hadn't been seen in millennia, and the librarians fled in terror, and on the edges of the Andromeda galaxy, automated defense satellites that predated the Galactic Council itself suddenly came online and began scanning for threats, and in the core, world species that rarely involved themselves in galactic politics began to send urgent messages To their representatives, the architects were beings of pure energy who had shaped the first warp gates 80,000 years ago, and they existed in a state between dimensions, and they rarely manifested in normal space, but now they sent an emissary to the Galactic Council, and the emissary appeared in the Great Hall like a star-given form, and its voice was the sound of galaxies turning, and it spoke one word, and that word was violation. And then it vanished, and the council members looked at each other in confusion, and concerned. The eternal gardeners had seeded life across 1,000 worlds when the galaxy was young, and they were patient and peaceful, and they had never withdrawn from galactic affairs in all of recorded history. But now they recalled every ambassador and every representative, and they sealed their borders, and they sent no explanation, and the galaxy began to feel the first tremors of fear. The witnesses were the keepers of history, and they recorded everything, and their archives contained the complete record of galactic civilization going back hundreds of thousands of years, and scholars traveled from across the galaxy to study in their great libraries. But now the witnesses sealed every archive and locked every door and posted guards at every entrance, and when asked why, they simply said, "What comes next must not be recorded," and refused to say more. Palmoth was a junior archivist for the Galactic Council, and he was an insectoid being from the world of Chitterax, and he had compound eyes and 6 manipulator arms and a passion for ancient documents that his colleagues found tedious, and he was working late in restricted archives when he found the source of the automated alert that had been triggering for 3 days, and nobody else had noticed because nobody else cared about alerts from systems 40,000 years old. The alert led him to a data crystal sealed in a containment field, and the crystal was labeled in a script he had to run through 6 different translation matrices before he could read it, and it said, "Primordial Accords, Emergency, Access Only." And Palmoth felt his antenna quiver with excitement and dread, because the primordial accords were legend and myth, and supposedly the founding documents of the first galactic community, but no one had seen them in living memory. Broke the seal with shaking manipulators, and loaded the crystal into a reader, and the data unfurled before him in holographic splendor, and it was beautiful and terrible, and it contained treaties and agreements and laws, written by species whose names he didn't recognize, and civilizations that had risen and fallen before his own ancestors had crawled from their planet's oceans, and at the center of it all was one law written in every language that have ever existed. "No harm shall come to the children of humanity," it read, and then, "For they are the universe's failsafe, and to threaten them is to invite extinction." And Palmoth read it 3 times, and then 4 times, and then he checked the seal and verified the authenticity. And this was real, and this was binding, and this had never been violated in 40,000 years until 3 days ago, when the council had ordered the evacuation of Terra Nova. Palmoth ran through the corridors with the data crystal clutched in his primary manipulator, and he burst into Councillor Vexstar's office without announcing himself, and Vexstar looked up in irritation and began to reprimand him, but Palmoth thrust the crystal forward and began babbling about the primordial accords and the ancient law, and the children left behind on Terra Nova, and Vexstar needed to authorize a rescue immediately. Vexstar examined the crystal with the dismissive air of someone who had dealt with too many overexcited junior staff members, and he scanned through the contents, and his expression never changed. And when he finished, he set the crystal down and looked at Palmoth with something like pity. "These are primitive superstitions from species long extinct," Vexstar said, and his voice was calm and patronizing. "The galaxy has moved beyond such irrational fears, and I will not divert council resources to rescue a handful of human larvae because of some ancient myth, and you should return to your regular duties and forget about this." Palmoth tried to argue, but Vexstar dismissed him, and the crystal was filed away, and Palmoth returned to his archives feeling hollow and defeated, and he didn't know what else to do, and he was just a junior archivist. And who would listen to him? On Terra Nova, the 17 children were running low on supplies, and they had been in the shelter for 5 days, and Maya Rodriguez maintained strict rationing and kept the younger ones occupied with games and stories and lessons, and she taught them math using ration packets, and she taught them geography by drawing maps in the dust, and she taught them courage by not letting them see her fear Sarah. Okonkwo asked Maya when their parents would come back, and Maya held the girl close and told her soon, and told her to be brave, and told her that humans always took care of their own. And somewhere deep inside, Maya believed it, because she had to believe it, because the alternative was unthinkable. Tommy Anderson, who was only 4, didn't understand why they couldn't go outside, and he cried for his mother, and the twins, Keiko and Yuki, tried to comfort him by singing songs their grandmother had taught them, and Marcus Chun organized the other kids into work groups to maintain the shelter systems, and everyone did their part, because Maya had taught them that survival meant working together. What none of them knew was that their shelter was being watched, and not by humans, and not by the council, but by something far older and far stranger, and the watchers existed in frequencies the children couldn't perceive, and they observed, and they calculated, and they waited for the moment when the ancient failsafes would need to activate a UES Defiant crossed into the Terra Nova system after 2 weeks of hard burn, and Sarah Chun stood on the bridge with her crew, and they were exhausted and running on stimulants and determination, and long-range sensors showed the council mining operation in full swing and showed no human life signs because the shelter was too deep and too shielded, and Sarah felt her heart sink, but she refused to give up. Then something impossible happened, and space itself seemed to ripple, and the defiant sensors went haywire, and warning klaxons sounded across every deck, and the view screen showed an energy field surrounding Terra Nova's moon, and it was massive, and it pulsed with power that registered off every scale, and was beautiful and terrifying. Sarah tried to hail the source of the field, but got no response, and she tried to scan through it, but their sensors couldn't penetrate, and she tried to find a way around it, but the field was perfect and complete and impenetrable, and she slammed her fist on the command console in frustration and demanded answers from a universe that seemed determined to keep her from her children. Then the communications officer gasped and pointed at her screen, and every frequency was lighting up, and every channel was receiving the same transmission, and it came from everywhere and nowhere, and it spoke in every language simultaneously, and the words burned themselves into every ear and every mind. "The children are protected," the voice said, and it was ancient and implacable. "The debt will be paid." Sarah Chun stared at the view screen and watched the impossible energy field pulse, and she didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty, and that was that the galaxy had just changed in ways no one could predict, and humanity's children were at the center of it all. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and representatives from hundreds of worlds demanded explanations and wanted to know what the energy field around Terra Nova was and why the ancient species were behaving so strangely, and Counselor Vexstar tried to maintain order, but his voice carried the first notes of uncertainty and fear. Pulmoth stood in the gallery and watched and clutched his data crystal, and he had sent copies of the primordial accords to every council member and to every major news network and to every academic institution he could find, and the galaxy was waking up to the reality of what had been done, and the reactions ranged from disbelief to horror. The changes began subtly, and Dr. Jennifer Park was teaching a physics class at MIT when she suddenly understood quantum entanglement in a way she never had before, and the equations wrote themselves in her mind in elegant perfection, and she could see the connections between forces that no human had ever perceived. And across the campus, 12 other professors experienced similar breakthroughs, and within an hour every major university on Earth was reporting the same phenomenon. In Beijing, a maintenance worker named Liu Wei, was repairing a water pump when he felt something shift inside his mind, and suddenly he could sense the water flowing through every pipe in the entire building. And he could feel the pressure and the temperature and the flow, and when he focused, he could move the water with his thoughts, and he dropped his wrench in shock, and the sound echoed in the sudden silence of his awakening awareness. Similar events occurred across every human world and colony and station and ship, and children in schools began floating pencils without touching them, and doctors performing surgery found they could sense their patients' physiology in impossible detail, and engineers discovered they could interface directly with their equipment, and pilots reported feeling their ships as extensions of their own bodies. The Earth Defense Force headquarters erupted into controlled chaos as reports flooded in, and geneticists scrambled to understand what was happening, and the conclusion was impossible but undeniable. And dormant genes that had been hiding in human DNA for millennia were activating, and every human in the galaxy was developing psionic abilities at an exponential rate. Admiral Chun felt it too, and she was standing on the bridge of the Defiant when her mind expanded, and suddenly she could sense every crew member on her ship, and every system, and every circuit, and the energy field around Terra Nova no longer looked impenetrable, but instead looked like a puzzle she was beginning to understand. And the feeling was exhilarating and terrifying. On the moon below Maya, Rodriguez and the 16 other children felt the change, and it came to them first and strongest, because children's minds were more flexible and more open, and Maya found she could sense the thoughts and feelings of every child in the shelter, and she could project calm and courage and hope, and the younger ones stopped crying and started smiling, and they knew somehow that everything was going to be all right. But the awakening of human psionic potential was only the beginning, and across the galaxy ancient weapons caches began to unlock themselves, and on a dead world in the Orion Arm, a vault that had been sealed for 3 million years, recognized human genetic signatures in passing ships and opened its doors, and inside were weapons that could crack planets and armor that could withstand stars and ships that made the Council's fleet look like children's toys on Earth beneath the ancient ruins of Göbekli Tepe. Massive structures began to rise from the ground, and they had been buried there for so long that they had become myth and legend. But now they emerged into the sunlight, and they were star fortresses and defense platforms and weapon arrays, and they hummed with power that came from sources humanity didn't understand, but could somehow operate instinctively. The archaeological sites at Stonehenge and the Nazca Lines and Easter Island and dozens of other locations revealed similar structures, and they all bore the same markings and the same design, and they all responded to human presence and human will, and the realization hit the scientific community like a thunderbolt. And these weren't built by ancient humans, but built for humans by someone who knew they would need them someday. Dormant AI systems across the galaxy began activating, and they had been sleeping in asteroid fields and nebulas and dark matter clouds and waiting for 40,000 years, and now they recognized humanity as their commanders and pledged their allegiance and offered their knowledge and their power, and they spoke of the precursors who had built them and who had made preparations for this exact moment. The architects manifested again, but this time they appeared before the entire Galactic Council in full assembly, and their forms were terrible and beautiful, and they spoke in voices that resonated across dimensions. 40,000 years ago, we found Earth, they said, and their words carried the weight of cosmic truth. And we found something unprecedented in humanity, possessed an instinctive drive to protect their young that exceeded any survival programming we had ever observed, and they combined this with capacity for both magnificent creation and terrible destruction. And we made a calculation. The council chamber was silent, and 847 species listened, and none dared interrupt. Humanity would either become the galaxy's greatest protectors or its ultimate destroyers. The architects continued, and the deciding factor would be how the galaxy treated humanity's children. And we created the primordial accords as both law and trigger. And if humanity's children were threatened by the galactic community, then failsafes would activate to give humanity the power to defend them, and you have triggered those failsafes. Vextar stood, and his crystalline form was dim, and he tried to speak, but his voice cracked, but they are just children. He managed to say, just 17 children, and surely this is disproportionate. There is no proportion when it comes to children. The eternal gardeners spoke, and they manifested as living vines of light that grew from the floor of the chamber. We have seeded 1,000 worlds, and on every world we have seen that species who protect their young thrive, and species who abandon them perish, and humanity's drive to protect their children is the strongest we have ever measured, and that drive is why we chose them. The witnesses appeared last, and they were robed figures whose faces could not be seen, and they carried the weight of all history, and we have recorded everything. They said in voices like rustling pages, and in all our records spanning hundreds of thousands of years we have never seen a species fight as fiercely for their young as humanity, and we have seen human parents die to save their children, and we have seen human soldiers sacrifice themselves so the children they never met might live, and we have seen humanity's greatest heroes and most celebrated figures, and almost all of them began by asking how they could make the world better for the next generation. The witnesses turned to face Vextar directly, and you left 17 children to die for profit, they said, and their voices carried condemnation. And in doing so, you broke the one law that the universe itself enforces, and now you will see why that law exists. Admiral Chun received a transmission on the Defiant, and it came from the AI systems that had awakened, and they offered her command of a fleet that had been waiting in dimensional fold space for 40,000 years, and she could have destroyers and dreadnoughts and carriers and weapons that could shatter suns, and the power to reduce the Galactic Council to ash and dust. She stood on her bridge and felt the new abilities flowing through her, and she could sense the vast fleet waiting for her command, and she could feel the righteous anger of every human in the galaxy focusing like a laser on Terra Nova and on their children, and she knew that with a single word she could start a war that would remake the galaxy. But Sarah Chen made a different choice, and she broadcast on all frequencies, and every council ship and every station in every world heard her words. I am Admiral Sarah Chun of the Earth Defense Force, she said, and her voice was calm and hard as diamond. And I have come for our children, and you have 72 hours to release them, and allow me to bring them home safely. And if you comply, then this ends peacefully, and humanity will take our place as protectors, not just of our children, but of all the galaxy's children. And if you do not comply, then you will learn why the precursors built failsafes around us, and why the universe made protecting our children a cosmic law. And I promise you that you do not want to learn that lesson. The transmission ended, and the Defiant held position, and the awakened fleet remained in fold space, and Sarah Chun waited, and the galaxy held its breath. Counselor Vextar stood in his private chambers and watched the stars and calculated probabilities and outcomes, and his mind raced through scenarios, and he had not risen to his position by accepting defeat, and he would not start now and there. There had to be a solution, and there had to be a way to resolve this crisis that didn't end with his civilization reduced to rubble. He called a secret meeting with the Council's military commanders, and they gathered in a shielded room and spoke in whispers. And the topic was simple and terrible. And how do we eliminate the problem before it eliminates us? General Krathix of the Volani Star Command proposed the obvious solution, and we destroy Terra Nova's moon, he said in his gurgling voice. And we eliminate the evidence, and we eliminate the children, and we tell the humans it was a tragic accident, and we show them wreckage and debris, and we manufacture a disaster, and without the children, there is No violation and the failsafes will deactivate. Vexstar listened and his crystalline structure pulsed with agitated light, and he knew this was wrong, and he knew this was monstrous, and he also knew that it might be their only chance, and how long would it take? He asked, and his voice was hollow. 6 hours to position the fleet. Graphics replied, and 1 minute to reduce the moon to dust, and we have weapons that can shatter a planetary body, and no one will find remains, and no one will prove what happened. Around the table, other commanders nodded, and they were afraid. And fear makes people do terrible things, and they convinced themselves they were protecting trillions of lives by sacrificing 17. And they told themselves it was mathematics and cold logic, and the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few, and they did not admit that they were simply trying to hide their mistake by murdering children. The fleet began to move, and Council warships broke orbit from their stations and formed up in attack formations, and they were sleek and deadly and represented the combined military might of hundreds of worlds. And Admiral Chun's sensors detected the movement, and she knew immediately what they intended. She opened a channel to the Council and demanded they stand down, and Vexstar responded personally, and this is Council business, he said, and you will withdraw your vessel and allow us to resolve the situation. If you fire on that moon, I will consider it an act of war, Sarah replied, and her voice was ice. And you will face consequences beyond your imagination. You have one ship, Vexstar said, and he tried to sound confident. And we have thousands, and your threats are empty, and you should run home too. Earth while you still can. Sarah Chen smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile, and she spoke one word to the AI systems. Waiting in fold space, and that word was come. Reality tore open around the Defiant, and ships began emerging from dimensional fold, and they came by the dozens, and then by the hundreds, and then by the thousands, and they were massive and ancient, and beautiful and terrible, and they made the Council fleet look like toys, and each one was a masterpiece of precursor engineering, and each one responded to human command as if they had been waiting their entire existence for this moment. The Council ships stopped their advance, and their commanders stared at their sensors in disbelief and tried to understand what they were seeing, and General Krathix felt his combat instincts screaming at him to retreat, but pride and fear kept him frozen on. Earth, the risen star fortress is activated, and targeting systems that could hit a target from across the galaxy, locked onto every Council military installation and government center, and the message was clear. And if you harm our children, we will burn your worlds, and humanity had the power to do it, and everyone knew it, but the ancient species intervened before the first shot could be fired, and the architects manifested in the Council fleet, and their presence disrupted every weapon system, and every shield and every engine, and the ships hung dead in space and helpless. The Eternal Gardeners appeared on the bridge of every Council ship and spoke directly to each commander. And if you proceed, you will not face humanity's wrath alone, they said in voices like growing things. And you will face us, and you will face the judgment of every ancient species. And we have maintained this galaxy for eons, and we will not allow it to be destroyed by your cowardice. The witnesses manifested in the Council chambers themselves, and they stood before the assembled representatives and removed their hoods, and beneath were faces of every species that had ever existed, and they spoke with the voices of history itself. We have watched civilizations rise and fall, they said, and we have recorded their triumphs and their failures, and we have seen the pattern that determines which species endure and which perish, and species that protect their children survive, and species that sacrifice their children die. And it is that simple and that immutable, and you stand at a crossroads. Pelmoth stood in the gallery and watched and felt vindicated and terrified, and he had not wanted to be right, and he had not wanted the galaxy to come so close to destruction. But here they were, and everything depended on what the council decided next on Terra Nova's moon Maya. Rodriguez felt the danger, and her newly awakened senses screamed warnings, and she gathered the children close and told them to be brave, and she projected calm and safety and love, and the younger ones huddled together and trusted her because she had not failed them yet, and she would not fail them. Now Sarah Okonkwo looked up at Maya and, "Are they coming for us?" she asked, and her voice was small. Maya nodded and held the girl tight, and yes, she said, "And your mother is up there, and she brought the cavalry, and everything is going to be okay." Tommy Anderson, who was 4, asked if they could go home soon, and the twins sang softly to themselves, and Marcus Chun checked the shelters. Integrity one more time, and all 17 children waited, and they did not know that the fate of the galaxy hung on their survival. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Defiant and commanded a fleet that could crack worlds, and she could feel the power thrumming through her and through every human in the galaxy, and she could sense the star fortresses on Earth ready to fire, and she could feel the righteous fury of her entire species focused on this one moment. But she also felt something else, and she felt the fear of the council species, and she felt their confusion and their desperation, and she understood that they had made a terrible mistake, but they were not evil, and they were simply beings who had never understood what it meant to be human, and what it meant to love children so fiercely that you would burn the galaxy to ash to protect them. She made her decision and opened a channel and broadcast to every ship and every station and every world. "I did not come here to wage war," she said, and her voice carried across the galaxy. "And I came here to save 17 children, and that is all I want, and I will take my children home, and then humanity will help you understand why they matter so much, and we will teach you what the precursors knew and what the ancient species have been trying to tell you. And children are not resources to be calculated and bargained and traded, and they are the future, and they are hope, and they are the reason we build and create and dream and sacrifice." She paused and let her words sink in. "And give me my children," she continued, "and I will stand down, and we will talk, and we will find a way forward together. But if you harm even one of them, then there will be no mercy, and no quarter and no second chances, and choose wisely and choose quickly." The energy field around Terra Nova's moon began to pulse, and the ancient safeguards waited for the council's response, and the precursor fleet held position, and every human in the galaxy held their breath, and Sarah Chun waited for the answer that would determine if the galaxy would see peace or annihilation. Counselor Vextar stood in the council chambers and felt the weight of his decision, and he could order the attack and doom his civilization and satisfy his pride, and or he could surrender and admit fault and face the consequences and save trillions of lives. He thought about his own children, and he had 3 of them, and they were grown now, but he remembered when they were young, and he remembered the fierce protective love he had felt, and he remembered that he would have done anything to keep them safe. He understood finally, and he understood what humanity had been trying to tell them, and he understood what the primordial accords meant, and he understood why the universe itself enforced the law. Vextar stood tall and addressed the council. "And we have made a grievous error," he said, and his voice was steady, "and we will rectify it immediately and order all fleet units to stand down and contact the mining operations and evacuate all personnel from Terra Nova's moon and allow Admiral Chun to retrieve the children. And we were wrong, and I was wrong, and I accept full responsibility." The energy field around Terra Nova's moon dissolved like morning mist, and the ancient safeguards recognized that the threat had passed, and the precursor fleet began to phase back into fold space, and the weapons would be returned to their slumber. But they would never sleep as deeply again, and humanity would always have access to them, should they need to protect their children. Admiral Sarah Chun brought the Defiant down through the atmosphere, and the descent was smooth and controlled, and Her crew worked with newfound precision as their enhanced abilities made every task easier and more intuitive. And she landed the ship 200 meters from the emergency shelter and shut down the engines and stood. Her hands were shaking, and she had commanded fleets and faced down the council and held the power to reshape the galaxy. But now she was simply a woman about to reunite children with their families, and the magnitude of what they had all been through hit her like a physical way. The shelter door opened and Maya Rodriguez emerged first, and she shielded her eyes against the sunlight, and behind her came 16 other children, and they were dirty and tired and scared, but they were alive and whole and safe. Sarah Chun walked down the Defiance ramp and crossed the distance between them as she knelt down in the dust and looked at Maya. And, "Are you hurt?" she asked, and her voice was gentle. "Is anyone injured?" Maya shook her head, and, "We're okay," she said, and then her composure cracked and tears streamed down her face. "We knew someone would come, and we knew humans don't leave each other behind." Sarah opened her arms and Maya collapsed into them, and then all 17 children were there, and they were crying and laughing and holding on to her, and Sarah held them and told them they were safe, and told them they were going home, and told them their parents were waiting. Sarah, Okonkwo, looked up at the Admiral with her 9-year-old face streaked with tears. "And is my mom really up there?" she asked. "Yes," Sarah Chun replied. "And she's on a ship 3 days from here, and she's been frantic, and she loves you so much, and we're going to take you to her right now." The children boarded the Defiant, and the crew had prepared quarters for them and had replicated every comfort item they could think of, and within an hour the ship was climbing back to orbit, and Terra Nova's moon fell away behind them, and the children pressed their faces to viewports and watched their temporary prison disappear across the galaxy. The crisis began to wind down, and the Council fleet dispersed and returned to normal stations, and the ancient species began to withdraw, but they left warnings and reminders, and they made it clear that humanity was now under permanent protection, and that the failsafes would remain active in case they were ever needed again. The witnesses unsealed their archives, but they added one final entry, and it was marked as the most important document in galactic history, and it read, "On this day, the galaxy learned that some laws transcend politics and economics and power, and the law of protecting children is written not in treaties, but in the fabric of reality itself." Helmoth was summoned before the Council, and he expected to be punished for going over Vextar's head and spreading classified documents. But instead he was commended and promoted to senior archivist and given responsibility for maintaining the primordial accords and ensuring they were never forgotten. Again, the young insectoid accepted the position and made it his life's work to teach every new council member about the accords and about humanity and about why children mattered, and he lived for another 300 years and trained thousands of students, and none of them ever forgot his lessons. 3 days later, the Defiant rendezvoused with the evacuee fleet, and the reunions happened in the main hangar bay, and parents who had thought their children lost forever held them again, and the sound of crying and laughter echoed off the metal walls, and Sarah Chun stood back and watched and felt the tight knot in her chest finally loosen. Sarah Okonkwo's mother ran across the hangar and swept her daughter into her arms, and they held each other and rocked back and forth, and neither could speak, and words were inadequate anyway, and they were together, and that was all that mattered. A council formally apologized, and the apology was broadcast across every world and every species. Heard Vextar admit fault and accept responsibility, and he resigned his position and spent the rest of his life working to reform council policies and ensure nothing like this could happen again. The council was restructured, and humanity was given a permanent seat and veto power over any decisions affecting juvenile members of any species, and it was a level of influence that normally took millennia to earn. But the galaxy recognized that humanity had proven themselves worthy. The primordial Accords were updated, and humanity was designated as the official protectors of all children across the galaxy, and regardless of species, and it was a sacred trust, and humanity took it seriously, and within a generation human ships patrolled trade routes specifically to prevent child trafficking, and human social workers helped dozens of species develop better childcare systems, and human teachers spread across the galaxy sharing educational techniques. The ancient species returned to their various states of semi-retirement, but they maintained contact with humanity, and the architects taught human engineers how to build warp gates, and the eternal gardeners shared their knowledge of terraforming and biological engineering, and the witnesses opened their archives to human scholars, and a new age of cooperation began on Earth. The star fortresses remained active, but they were repurposed, and they became centers of learning and research and defense, and they stood as reminders of what humanity could do when pushed, but also as symbols of what humanity chose to do instead, and humanity chose to protect and teach and nurture. Admiral Sarah Chun was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given command of the new Child Protection Force, and it was a joint operation between Earth and dozens of allied species, and she served with distinction for another 20 years and retired with the knowledge that the galaxy was safer for children because of what she had done. Maya Rodriguez became something of a galactic celebrity, and she was interviewed by news networks from hundreds of worlds, and everyone wanted to know what it was like to be at the center of the crisis that changed everything, and she always gave the same answer. We were scared, she would say, but we trusted that someone would come, and we trusted that humans take care of their own, and we were right. And I think that's what the galaxy needed to learn, and that when children are in danger, you don't calculate cost and benefit, and you don't weigh profit and loss, and you just do whatever it takes to save them, and that's what makes us human. 10 years after the crisis, Maya was 24, and she joined the Child Protection Force herself, and she became a rescue specialist, and she saved hundreds of children from dozens of species, and she never forgot what it felt like to be the one waiting to be saved. The twins Keiko and Yuki Tanaka became xenolinguists and used their experience to help translate children's literature across species boundaries, and they created the first universal collection of children's stories that could be understood by any species. Marcus Chen became an engineer and helped design the next generation of emergency shelters and made sure they were equipped to sustain children for months if necessary, and his designs became standard across the galaxy. Tommy Anderson, who had been only 4 when it all happened, grew up and became a teacher and specialized in early childhood education. And he taught on 17 different worlds and helped thousands of children from dozens of species. And he always told them they were safe and they were valued, and they mattered. Sarah Okonkwo followed her hero, Admiral Chun, into the military and rose to the rank of captain and commanded her own ship and continued the work of protecting children, and she named her ship the New Hope after the colony, where she had learned what humanity truly stood for 20 years after the crisis. Admiral Chun retired, and she moved to a quiet house near the ocean, and she kept a garden and wrote her memoirs. And one day she received a visitor. Maya Rodriguez stood at her door, and she was older now and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had saved lives and made a difference. And she smiled. "And I wanted to thank you," she said. "And you came for us when no one else would, and you taught me what it means to be human. And I've spent my life trying to live up to that example." Sarah Chun invited her in, and they sat in the garden and drank tea and talked about the children they had saved, and the galaxy they had changed, and the future they had built together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the council hadn't backed down?" Maya asked. Sarah considered the question, and sometimes, she admitted, "But I like to think we would have found another way, and humanity's strength isn't in our weapons or our technology, and it's in our unwillingness to abandon those who need us, and especially children, and that's what the precursors saw in us 40,000 years ago. and that's what the galaxy sees in us now. Maya nodded and looked up at the sky where stars were beginning to appear, and the universe is safer because we're in it. She said, "No," Sarah corrected gently, "and the universe is safer because we chose to be protectors instead of destroyers. And we had the power to burn it all down, and we chose to build instead, and that choice is what the primordial accords were really about, and giving us the power to protect, while trusting that we would choose protection over revenge."